Hello, my name is Marshall Pamkin. Now, musical film is one of those genres that I've always had kind of a love-hate relationship for. Sure, I have seen a great deal of musical films in my 41 years on this planet, but for a long time it was something that just as a genre by itself didn't really resonate with me. Specific films, but the genre as itself not really. So for this project, I wanted to trace the evolution of musical films. Now, I was not able to find as much data or as many articles, sources on the evolution of the technical aspects of making musicals into films. So instead, I would like to provide an outlining commentary on the progression of musical films, just looking at it through the decades. Looking back on the history of cinema, particularly American cinema, developing musical productions into film projects seemed like a no-brainer after we went from the silent film era to the talking pictures. The first credited musical film was The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson in 1927. However, my research indicates that musicals didn't really pick up until 3 years later. In the year 1930 alone, over 100 musical films were put out by Hollywood, and it only skyrocketed through the 30s and into the 40s from there. The decline arguably truly began in the late 1950s. At this point, you already have a lot of what appeared to be film guilt throughout the late 40s and into the early 50s. Following World War II, there were so many men and women who were lost during the war. There were so many people who returned home to a different world. Not as many people wanted that musical, happy, joyous escape. It made it easier, it seemed, for people to have a more grounded cinematic viewing experience, and that was where we started to see the rise of drama as a prominent genre. Then as we roll into the 60s and eventually even the 70s, the rise of special effects really supported that dramatic storytelling, supported science fiction storytelling, supported fantastical storytelling, which started to leave musicals a little bit back in the dust. You still had some great musical cinema, especially in the 70s. You had the likes of Saturday Night Fever in 1977, you had the likes of Grease in 1978, The Wiz in 1978, but the toll that shift in attention and social consciousness took was really seen in the 80s, when we start to see a serious decline in musical cinema. Now, you still have a number of musical films such as Footloose, Popeye, a kind of a reboot of The Jazz Singer. You still have a number of films like that coming out throughout the 80s, which do keep musicals in the mind of the viewing audience, but at that point, musicals had gone to mostly on and off Broadway stages. There was, especially among the male population, there began to be this sense that musical was more for the feminine audiences. I know I grew up with kind of a mindset about musicals, not that they were bad in any sense, but they weren't very manly. It was one thing if you're getting paid and you're doing an awesome performance and it's great and it's fantastic, but for whatever reason, it took on a tone that masculine society seemed to unfortunately kind of rail against. Now, as we get into the 90s, then we see a sudden resurgence in musical film, particularly with animation as its primary medium and genre. Now, that's not to say that animated musicals hadn't happened before. Animated musicals go back to the 60s, if not earlier. But with the 90s, thanks particularly to Disney juggernauts, some of the films such as The Lion King, films such as The Little Mermaid, thanks to films such as that, musicals really started to pick up a whole lot more. Once we get into the 2000s, some of those same people, some of my generation that enjoyed those animated musicals of the 80s and the 90s, started helping with production and pushing forward more live-action musicals. So riding high on the success of films like Chicago in 2002, Rent in 2005, Sweeney Todd in 2007, Les Miserables in 2012, then we started to see that live-action that resurgence of live-action musical leading to such fantastic responses to musical films such as the biographical The Greatest Showman in 2017, and Hamilton going from a 2015 Broadway debut to a 2020 film debut on Disney Plus. That was fantastic to me. I absolutely love that. Now, looking at the rise and fall and rise again of musical cinema, it's quite easy to see how this genre could seem to kind of drop off again. But an important thing to note, at least from my own observations, I work in the open mic circuit for a long time in North Carolina and Tennessee, now where I'm living in Colorado, and most of the performers at my event are ages 20 and younger. And so many of them had their interest in history, in American history, reawakened by musical films such as Hamilton, reawakened by some other Broadway productions of that era. So I think it's important to note that even though musicals have gotten kind of a bad rap, especially once you got into the 60s through the 80s, even though musicals really kind of dropped off and they do not have exactly the power now that they did in the 30s and 40s, they are primed for a resurgence. They are a genre of film that can reach out and touch so many different audience members with such diverse tastes and interests. The Greatest Showman, La La Land, and Hamilton all being prime examples of this, that I think we're going to see even more from musical film coming up in the near future. And that is my brief, albeit rambling, chronology and commentary about the evolution of musical film. Again, my name is Marshall Pamkin. Thank you very much, and thank you for a wonderful and informative class. Hope you have a wonderful holiday.